I'm Tom Anichini, Chief Investment Strategist at GuidedChoice. I'm a CFA charter holder and a CFP certificate, and this is Trekking Through Retirement. Let's talk about inflation. You probably think of inflation as prices rising. There are monetary economists who define inflation as too much money chasing too few goods. Let's talk about some of these stories about how prices can wind up rising. Cost push inflation is when the costs of the inputs rise and the producers pass on the price increases to their customers. Think about in 2021, 2022, when there were some supply chain problems and the United States couldn't get enough semiconductors. What happened? Well, not only did we see shortages in technologies you would think of, like computers and laptops and so on, but even automobiles, even used automobiles, their prices went up. Why? Well, because the producers had to pass their costs on to the consumers, partly to meet demand. So that's cost push inflation. What's demand pull inflation? Well, demand pull inflation is when all of a sudden there's a surge in demand for a certain item or a certain service. I can think of one easy example in the investment arena, and that being meme stocks. Some meme stocks of the last few years, such as AMC and GameStop. All of a sudden, people were working from home, flush with cash, and what did they have to spend it on? Well, they could speculate with it and chase prices up of meme stocks like GameStop, and prices went up. Let's talk about structural inflation. Structural inflation is when there are too few producers, and so they can almost dictate price increases of the things they sell to their consumers. And then the last thing I mentioned was built-in inflation. Built-in inflation is something we saw, especially during the late 70s, and that is when labor contracts, recognizing that they're in an inflationary environment, write into their contracts that their wages are going to go up each year according to some measure of cost of living increases. Those are the most common stories that describe inflation and how it can perpetuate. How is inflation measured? Let's talk about a few different measurements of inflation. Broadly, inflation in the United States is measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And they measure two broad types of inflation: producer price inflation and consumer price inflation. And if you look at the components of producer price inflation and consumer price inflation, you might notice a lot of overlap. The difference being in two things. One is in weights. How much do producers spend on these items versus consumers, and also on how finished are the goods. So you would expect producers to spend more on raw materials and goods that aren't quite finished, and consumers, of course, are buying finished goods, retail items. And the way inflation is typically expressed is on a year-over-year change in either producer price or a consumer price index. Something worth mentioning is a concept called chain-weighted consumer price inflation. And that's based on chain-weighted consumer price index changes. The weights that consumers spend on items change over time, especially if their prices change. And so with chain weighting, the weights are adjusting to reflect the changes in consumer purchases. And so chain-weighted consumer price inflation tends to be lower than the traditional measurement of consumer price inflation. In recent years, we've all felt the effects of inflation. Individuals often have to change their plans. They might have to cancel vacation plans. They might have to adjust the way they travel. Policymakers want to corral inflation. They don't want runaway inflation. And in the United States, we're pretty used to inflation of 3% or less. So what policymakers will do, especially central bankers, they will raise interest rates. And businesses might pass on price increases to their customers. They also might start borrowing because they recognize that if they borrow $1,000 today, in 10 years, what they'll have to pay back won't be worth as much as the $1,000 today, especially if it's an inflationary environment. How do individuals manage inflation? Well, I already mentioned making substitutions. When I was in graduate school, it was during a time of a brief war that caused gasoline prices to spike. And because of the budget I was on, and if you remember being a student, how that works, I actually had to stop driving to school and take public transportation instead because I couldn't afford to drive to school. But I could afford to take public transportation. However, obviously that took much longer and it was less convenient. So now it was a tax on my time and my productivity. So it's an adjustment I could afford to make. Not everyone can make adjustments. Another adjustment individuals can make is they could take on part-time work, maybe gig work. These are some of the things that people might take to manage inflation. It might turn out that someone might actually have to relocate. They might have to move because it's become too expensive to remain living where they're living right now. So what are the takeaways? The takeaways are the precise causes of inflation can be elusive. Another is many aspects of inflation cause feedback that cause inflation to perpetuate. And finally, be prepared to adjust your lifestyle in order to manage your ability to accommodate inflation, especially since we don't know when it might end.